Hello everyone, welcome to Voice Essentials for another live hangout. I know I usually let the pre-roll music finish, but I just couldn't wait to get started. So here we go. It is going to be so good to hang out with you for the next 30, 40, 50 minutes, who knows. I think we're going to have a great conversation with our guest, Dr. Shannon Coates, and I'll be introducing her to you again because of course she's been on the show before, but it'll be good to have her and introduce you to her again in a moment. Of course, if you're watching this as a replay, welcome. For those of you who are watching the show live, make sure you leave your questions in the comments, no, the other way, comment section, and the live chat, so that if you do have any questions, hopefully maybe we'll get some time to throw those questions towards Dr. Coates a little bit later, because we're going to be talking everything bias today. Did you know you have a bias? Regardless of whether you realize it or not, we all exist with filters that we're feeding everything through from in every aspect of our lives, and it also has an impact on our singing. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Couple of pieces of news that I just want to bring you up to speed with. First of all, this Wednesday, we have a new pre-record video that will be going live. As you know, I'm currently only doing monthly pre-record videos as I'm preparing my online singing course for beginner and intermediate singers. So make sure that you take advantage of the one that will be going live this week. Also, in a month's time, the December live pre-record video is a big video, one of my ones that I spend a little bit more coin on and get special animations done for it. And this one we are looking at voice classification. How do you accurately identify your voice type? Is that even a thing? Do contemporary singers need voice classification? We're going to discuss all of that in that big video. That'll be happening in December, early December. But again, make sure you check out, we're looking at pentatonic scales this Wednesday. The foundational scale of much of what we hear in contemporary music. So make sure you look at it, make sure you watch it all the way through, because there's a lot of really great value in that video for you. Another piece of news that I wanted to share with you, and I kind of have been teasing about this news for the last couple of weeks, and it's now appropriate for me to let you all know that recently I was nominated and subsequently elected to the role of National President for the Australian Voice Association. To say that I'm humbled by this position and being appointed to this position by my peers is an understatement. The Australian Voice Association, for those of you who may not have heard of it, is a multidisciplinary group that brings into one association laryngologists, ENTs, speech pathologists, and singing teachers, acting voice teachers, physiotherapists that are interested in voice. Basically, if you think of the voice care team, then that's what the Australian Voice Association collectively represent, and that's our membership. And I've been a part of the AVA since the year 2000. So I was very humbled to be asked to step up and be the national president for that. And I've been on the board for the national board for the last 2 years, but I got the tap on the shoulder, and that all went through. And so just wanted to let you know, and occasionally I might even, for those of you who are singing teachers who watch the channel, I might even let you know about different events that the AVA are doing occasionally, if it's appropriate, here on the channel. So just wanted to let you know that. Let's get into the rest of the show. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I did say to Dr. Shannon Coates before that half of the reason why I get her back onto the show, and this is a bit the same with Michelle recently, is because I just like hanging out with these ladies. They're awesome, and I think you're going to really enjoy having her and listening to everything she's got to say on this subject of bias. So don't go away, stick around. This is going to be a lot of fun.
Sound check. Check 1, check 2.
Heidi-ho, welcome to the show again, Dr. Coates. So good to have you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here, Dr. Dan.
And at a more reasonable hour this time.
Yes, it's pretty fabulous to not be midnight, although it does still feel like midnight. What am I, who am I kidding?
You're only a week in, aren't you, to the daylight saving change?
We're a day in.
A day in. Okay. So yeah, you're right. Okay. I saw that. I just saw in the chat that Karen from Singwise, who I know you know, also was noting that it's nice to not be having to chime in so early. So I'm glad that that's working out for everyone in the Northern Hemisphere, which is fantastic. Hey, before we get started, I want to bring people's attention to, let me just bring this up, because you have got, actually, we'll show people this. Now, this is your website, right?
This is, yes.
This is the very fancy, oh, that's a familiar, look at that. We'll just sit it there right there. I know, right? Sure. That's a familiar photo. And look, a fabulous site that people can jump on and you can sing your... Do you know what I love? I love your turn of phrase. You just use the most fantastic rhetoric on your websites and in your posts, and you're a lot of fun. And also, I'd encourage people, and all the links are in the description section below, everyone. Go and check out Shannon's blog, because you do these Fab Fives, don't you? Where you send out, you sort of direct people to different things that are fabulous, and the top Fab Five. But here's, I just want to give you an opportunity, Shannon, to talk about this, your Vocal Instrument 101 course.
Yes. So the Vocal Instrument 101, this is a course that I developed specifically for voice teachers especially voice teachers who have not had a chance to, say, do a voice pedagogy course, for example, or who perhaps who did that course maybe a few years back, and maybe that information has either become a lot more clear now that we have a little bit more research, or perhaps they weren't paying as close attention in their undergrad as they maybe should have. Or for some, I mean, there are lots of teachers out there who didn't do necessarily a classical voice degree, which is where we tend to get the voice ped courses, of course.
Yeah.
So perhaps just didn't get the chance to do a voice ped course. And that's basically why I developed it. You know, I had the chance to go back to school and do a master's and then a doctorate in voice pedagogy. And, you know, I had that opportunity. And I teach voice ped as well. I teach undergrad voice ped at a couple of universities. So this is the course, and all of the outline that you're seeing on the screen right now. That is super sciencey, but it's a breakdown of the information in a way that is, I hope, a little bit humorous, but also quite palatable. So taking the information that you kind of wish you had and making it digestible and palatable.
Can I tell you that, because I'm a great believer in revision is the mother of all learning.
Yes.
It's a little saying that I have, and I've had it since being at university myself, and in fact I by virtue of university administrations, I actually had to I did a graduate certificate in vocal pedagogy, and then when I was then enrolled into my master's program, I then had to do exactly the same course again.
Okay.
We won't get into the university's goings on, because I had done quite well the first time round, so there was sort of anywho. So long story short, though, I look back and I'm actually really kind of glad that I had to do it a second time.
Yes.
Because that 7% that we retain first time round, significantly improved the second time. In the moment, in the first time round, I did very well.
Yeah.
But it's not about doing well in the moment. It's about what you retain. And I have been looking at your little course and thinking, I shouldn't call it little. I've been looking at your course and thinking to myself, do you know what? From a revision point of view, it wouldn't harm me to go through it. You can never be, consider yourself higher or mightier than these sorts of things. Revision is such a powerful learning tool.
I agree. And that was actually my experience as well, going through the university course in my graduate degrees, going through those courses. And I had done a voice ped course in my undergrad, but just going through the information again. And I'll tell you frankly, every time I teach this course, and I do it every year, I teach it, and sometimes I do it at a couple of universities at a time.
Yeah.
There's more information that just becomes more settled and
Yes.
usable
Yes.
in the studio for me.
Yes.
Every year.
Oh.
And it's not necessarily new information, it's just information that I now am able to apply in a better way.
Yeah.
So every year.
So look, I would be encouraging you, singing teachers and singers alike, because the way you approach things, Shannon, I know that it'll be highly accessible to most people. So, I'd encourage everyone, go and check it out and have a look at it and give it some consideration. I think it will be awesome. Okay, let's talk about bias, shall we?
Shall we?
Shall we? Everyone has a bias, and in fact, I think because some people get really concerned about this, don't they? Thinking, I don't want to feel like I've got a bias. Actually, what's more concerning is when people don't realize they've got one.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think, just going back to where I've come from, and actually when you're talking about voice classification, this is something that I talk about in and you said, is there even such a thing for contemporary singers? And this is something that I talk about in voice ped classes all the time, is the fact that if you have been trained in a classical tradition, and if you have come through university in a classical tradition, or even if your voice teacher in your high school was primarily a classically trained singer, you have a very specific idea of what soprano means. You have a very specific idea of what tenor means. You have these voice classifications are based on our classical style ideas of what those words mean, right?
Yes.
So when we come into teaching music theater or singing music theater, for example, those classifications don't mean the same thing. They really don't. And in some cases, they don't mean what you think they mean. And when we get into contemporary singing, so when we get into contemporary commercial music, we want to call it that, those classifications mean even less. Like they cease to have any meaning.
Yeah, and
at some level.
And in fact, my observation online has been that it really trips people up.
Yes.
When they're using they're using language that is built and predicated upon classical idealism, which has its place, and both of you both of us would readily acknowledge that it has its place. It's not a matter of it being right, wrong, or indifferent. It's a matter of the appropriate application of said terms.
Absolutely, and understanding where your understanding of those terms come from.
Yeah.
Just knowing, you don't have to know specifically what it means, but you do need to know that when I say soprano, my student, or whoever you're talking to, may have a completely different idea of what you mean by that.
Yeah.
and this actually
No, go.
Well, this comes up as well because at the University of Toronto, where I primarily teach, the folks who take that course, the voice ped course, come from our education stream, our performance stream, and our jazz stream. So the jazz stream is a performance stream, but it's it is 100% jazz, and they do no classical, and the classical stream is 100% classical, and they do no jazz. So they'll I ask everybody at the beginning of the class, what voice type are you, knowing full well that I'm going to get some fun stuff coming up, because the jazz majors will say, well, I'm a contralto.
Right.
And all the classical singers are like, really? Okay. Or the jazz singers will say, like, how come there aren't any mezzos in the room? Like, how come everybody over there is a soprano? Like, why is... So there's a real... I mean, that's often the very first class in my voice ped course. That's often the very first thing that I talk about, because that introductory class will have such an obvious difference between, or all of the jazz guys will introduce themselves as altos.
Yeah, right.
And all of the classical guys are like, there are no altos. Aren't you mezzos? So that's often the very first thing that I talk about in the very first class, is just the fact that we're coming from a couple of different backgrounds, and the terms don't mean what you think they mean.
It speaks so strongly to the importance of language, and the importance of being prepared, especially in this teaching, singing, learning space, to always own and ground your language, so that you preface and essentially frame everything that you say, or be prepared to give an account for every term you use, essentially. And for example, a few weeks back, I was sitting on a panel of voice. There was 4 of us. Brian Gill, do you know Brian?
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, so I was on a panel with Brian and David Sisko and Irene Bartlett, and it was being chaired by Deb Filand, who is a very well-known speech pathologist from Melbourne.
Okay.
And we were talking about belt, and right. And the actual panel was titled "The Elephant in the Room," and I think that the title was misleading, because actually, when we listened to everyone's personal definition of belt, they were all quite appropriate.
Yeah.
And so in that person's, when you're talking the native language of your own teaching studio, that your students have learnt to be conversant in that native language of the studio, that's appropriate to use the term in the manner that you have defined. It's when we step outside into the bigger world where, for example, as an example, I guess, the English language has been currently has been defined as the international language. And so we all have to step into the English language internationally, and it's a bit the same with pedagogy, isn't it? We're still developing that international standard of communication. What are your thoughts about that?
Yes, absolutely. Well, and part of what in classical singing, again, with our tradition of voice ped, we have taken so many terms from other languages, from French, from Italian primarily, and some German as well, but primarily Italian. So we have all of these terms that we have translated from the original Italian, which were originally based on sensation and all of, not on what we're seeing or what we're what we know in terms of science, based on what we feel, which fine, that's what we had. So then those terms, not only are they based on a sensation, they're also then translated from the original term. So this is another one that the other one, obviously chest voice and head voice, but the other one is like appoggio breath, right? Which is another one where the classical singers, and if you are trained classically, you have the idea that the apajo breath, or this balanced breath, as Scott McCoy calls it in his text, that this is a breath that is the epitome of the best kind of breathing for all singing. And it's just not. It's just not. It's not useful. It's not, in general, the kind of breathing that we think of when we think of a apajo breath or balanced breath, is not useful for belting.
Yeah.
In general. It's not useful for any kind of sort of, if we want to say belting anyway, it's not useful for high pressure singing, let's put it that way.
Yeah. Thank you for owning and grounding your term.
Yes. Oh, we would figure out the terms. But yeah, so it's wonderfully useful for classical singing, of course, for 90% of the classical singing that we do, because we require this kind of flow in the breath, and we require this kind of release through the larynx that the apajo breath can give us. But it's really not useful for a high belt, for example. It's really not useful for, say, dancers, music theater singers who are dancers.
So let me throw this at you, because I mean, you am I right in thinking, recalling that your doctoral subject was breath management?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, my doctoral paper is on the terminology we use to describe breathing for singing.
Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, if someone in the world has the right to be commenting on this subject, it is Dr. Shannon Coates. So let me ask you a question as an expert in the field of breath management. And I'm genuinely asking because I don't know the answer to this. I'm so keen to dig into your knowledge now. Are you suggesting or saying that apajo, which literally, to my knowledge, is defined as to lean on the breath? Is that a literal interpretation? So, are you?
Can be.
Sure. Is that? So, are you saying that for most classical singers that's actually an appropriate application of the but with contemporary singing, so we get into ectomorph, endomorph. Is it more nuanced with contemporary singing?
It's not necessarily more nuanced, in my opinion. I'll just throw that in there too.
Yeah.
Here's what happens though, is that there's already this huge debate over what is apajo, what is proper breathing for classical singers anyway, and body types and male female and voice types and all that stuff. I mean, there's lots of debate about that, which in my opinion comes down to what works the best for you within best practice, right? So the best practice is release the abdomen, inhale so that we've got as much circumference around the thorax as possible. We're keep staying open across the top of the chest as much as possible. We're not, and then we're controlling the exhalation in using some form of gentle muscular antagonism, so we're not compressing. Right. So that is a sort of best practice, and this is for our classical singers, that is best practice. And however that looks in your body, and however that feels in your body, that's why you work with a singing teacher to figure out what works best for you in your body, right?
Yeah.
So, and that control of the exhalation that comes from this sort of gentle use of muscular antagonism and the sensation of the low breath and what we call apajo, that is that has been idealized as the best kind of breathing for all singers. And I am suggesting, in fact, I am saying from personal experience, that kind of inhalation where we have the full release of the abdomen, where we feel like we've got the full release in the torso, where we are then expanding and having this kind of buoyant release of the air, or support, if you will, that kind of released buoyant support, that kind of breathing and then use of the breath is not useful necessarily for singers who need a high intensity subglottal pressure to create the kind of sound that they're creating. So for example, a belter who requires this kind of intense release of the air, not a kind of spinning, released flow release of the air, which is what we need in classical singing, no matter what kind of classical singer you are. So this kind of inhalation where everything is released and open and we do all of this kind of gentle muscular antagonism to have control over the exhalation for the flow, that's not useful for a belt.
Yeah,
What's
right.
useful for a belt in general is to have an inhalation where we feel a rib cage expansion, or even just feeling somewhere in the torso and the upper body a little bit, but not to the same extent necessarily as what we're going to feel as a classical singer, and then having a little bit of a lock-in in the torso actually, rather than this kind of buoyant released exhalation or buoyant released feeling in the torso as we exhale, right? We get a little bit of a lock-in feeling for a belt and for a high belt sound generally. And for high intensity singing, lots of singers, lots of contemporary singers.
And I have not studied this subject to the depth that you have. Doctorates take us deep and low to the dark night of the soul, but
yes.
But that's what you've just outlined is where I've intuitively arrived in my studio, and I'm in the way I think about it is as a combining of the ideals of both appoggio and accent, and applying them in a hybrid manner. And I was encouraged, I think, really early on in my development as a singing teacher to sort of actually abandon the ideas of appoggio, and I never could, because I could see value in some of the aspects of appoggio, and so I couldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I wanted to hold on to the baby, but yet there is certainly value in what accent, some ideas and understandings that accent brings as well. So,
and I mean, there's no problem for me. I feel like there's no problem in using what is of value from the ideals of appoggio or balanced breathing. The problem, I think, comes in when we've got well-trained classical singers who are working with music theater singers and who are espousing all of the appoggio and asking their singers to create a belt sound using some kind of flow phonation. Or flow phonation in their idealized sense of it, and not realizing that that's actually probably impossible for their singer to produce.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think it's Ken Bozeman who talks about, he differentiates, and I think this is helpful to a point. He differentiates between. I'm just conscious of the fact that we have literally gone down a tributary here. We're way off. We are way off topic, but it's interesting.
Well, we're still on topic, because if your bias is classical and you're well trained classically, then you're going to be talking about appoggio and
I love it.
Go on.
So we pursue, and also I've just received a message from Linda. Hi, Linda, saying your audio keeps fluctuating. It'll be just the online environment. There's nothing we can do about it, everyone. I apologize. So, back to what we were saying. Ken, he differentiates the difference between subglottal pressure and subglottal flow, and he makes a distinction. And I think that's helpful, especially for contemporary singers, to recognize that yes, there is an increase in subglottal pressure for increase in volume. It's a necessary aspect. However, it's actually, we're trying to do that with low flow. And that's an important point. And we're getting into the nitty-gritty here, and I can hear arguments against what I'm saying, what Ken says. But I really subscribe to that idea. We're trying to, we have to acknowledge that the vocal folds are coming together in a manner that is going to adduct with a higher level of shearing force, etc., when we're belting. However, if there's too much push in that flow, then you're going to constrict. Then you're going to be in trouble.
Yes. And yes, absolutely. I mean, we have to, there are always the fact, right? It's always, there are always all of the other factors.
Yeah.
There are always many factors involved there.
Resonance, acoustics, all of, yeah.
Yes. And speaking of that, when we think about having a classical bias or background, we look at shape, for example, or the resonance shaping the resonator. We, high soft palate and wide pharynx, and I need to have space between my molars, and I need to have this forward feeling in the mouth, right, to increase. And when I sing higher, my chin should not follow. But that is a classical shape. That is a shaping that we use in classical singing to create the classical resonate, the shape that we require for classical resonators. And if you are teaching a contemporary singer, you want the opposite shape, frankly. So if the chin follows the pitch a little bit, that's not necessarily a bad thing, so long as the larynx isn't going too high in the throat, of course. But right, not going too high or becoming too constricted.
Yeah.
But we don't want the level of low larynx and open pharynx and width in the mouth that we're looking for in classical singing. We just don't. So that doesn't work for contemporary sound and contemporary production. So when we have classical teachers who are trained, who have that classical bias, and then they're looking at a contemporary singer or listening to a contemporary singer and saying, oh no, the chin's too far forward. Well, yes, that chin was probably too far forward in my example there, but the larynx is too high, the chin is too far forward, or you're too far forward this way.
Yeah.
Not necessarily to create that sound.
No, and it will, and in many respects, and this is where it's really important that if you're looking for a singing teacher, for example, and we talked about finding a good singing teacher a couple of weeks ago, so we won't go down that rabbit hole again. But it's identifying this is a little bit of a soapbox for me, so I will be very careful. Is your singing teacher, when a singing teacher says to you, and I'm now talking to you, our audience today, I'm a contemporary singing teacher, it must be more than their choice of repertoire. It has to be, being a contemporary singing teacher is not about the songs that are chosen to sing. It's about the way they are educating your voice and helping you to mechanically set up your instrument. It is not about the repertoire. I mean, it ultimately will be about the repertoire, but be very careful. And this is where I think, we go back 30, 40 years where a lot of rock singers, pop singers avoided singing lessons because, they were allowed to sing their pop and rock material in their lesson, but they were being set up classically, and as a result, it was changing their sound. That is not what good contemporary pedagogy is about any longer. And I would say with all due humility that if you find that your singing teacher is doing that and you want to sing contemporary material, but yet they are setting your voice up classically, either ask them to change what they're doing, or perhaps it might be appropriate for you to look for a different singing teacher. It's not to say that they're a bad singing teacher, it's just to say that they are taking your voice down a pathway that is likely not to be suitable for you as a student.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is, that's the crux of it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Understanding where our bias lies and then educating ourselves so that we know where our bias is, and then so that we can teach to what we need to teach without that bias.
Yeah. And look, there are people like yourself, Shannon, and there are I know a number of pedagogues who do teach both. Mm-hmm. I'm not one of them. I'm not one of them. Sure. I have my first 2 years at the Queensland Conservatorium were classical. it is best for everyone that I stay away from classical. Oh dear. And that's in spite of having had lessons with the wonderful head of voice, Margaret Schindler, who is fabulous. But I am no shining light of Margaret's teaching. So it is important that you find teachers that are appropriate to what you do, and that they themselves. I've just been at an event this last weekend where, in reflection, and I don't point this out as a massive issue, but in reflection there were some biases that were being presented through that I don't think were readily acknowledged to the level that perhaps they should have. And it was around this area of contemporary versus classical. So, at all levels, people are working through their bias. It just behoves us. This is a word that Michelle was using a lot last fortnight. It behoves us all, whether we be the pedagogues, the singing teachers, or whether we be the singers, to acknowledge those bias and to accept that there are filters. Some of those filters can be interchanged, some of them can be removed, and some of them may remain in place. And I think it's a mature, healthy singer that is able to acknowledge them and then work with them appropriately. Yeah.
I think too, as a listener, or as a student as well, I think it's really appropriate to remind yourself, if you are a classically trained singer, you will hear some forms of contemporary rock and some forms of belting and music theater as being effortful. However, if you are not trained as a classical singer, you will hear Pavarotti as being effortful. You will that sounds like effort to you. If you're not a classically trained singer or a classically trained listener, you will hear Leontine Price, you will hear Renee Flemings and think, wow, that sounds like a lot of yelling.
And now we're landing on the subject of the very title of today's video, which was "What You Hear is What You've Learnt."
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That is, and that influences, coming back, I mean, what you've learned influences you as a singing teacher, which is obviously where I work where I work mostly, influences what you hear as a singing teacher in your studio. So you hear, if you've been classically trained, you need to understand that when you hear someone belting in your studio, your first instinct may be that they are hurting themselves, or they're doing something that is so full of effort.
Yes, and I was hoping we'd touch on this very point, and because can I tell you that my voice doesn't easily distort when we start talking about vocal distortion and those sorts of extreme vocal uses. My mechanism does not easily go to that, even when I've received good instruction from pedagogues that know what they're doing and are able to do it well. Now, I do work with students who are able to actually vocally distort much better than I will ever be able to, because ingrained into my muscular memory and setup is my larynge doesn't do it well. Now, that's not to say that if I didn't dedicate myself to learning how to do it, that could be overcome. But certainly in those moments of, when you're in those master classes or those workshops at the conferences that you and I both go to, and the pedagogue, the person presenting will be up, so try this, and all the classical people are trying this vocal distortion thing, going, oh, this is terrible, it feels horrible. And just because in that singular moment of trying it for the first time that your larynge doesn't do it well and it feels horrible does not automatically mean that it's wrong.
Yes. Exactly.
because you're literally at that point you're filtering it through a muscular filter, a muscular bias.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's very interesting and something I hadn't actually thought about, but you're absolutely right. There is we have a learned way of producing sound. Absolutely. Yeah. And the uncomfortableness may not necessarily be just mental. It may be absolutely physical.
Physical and Associate Professor Di Hughes and I currently are furthering our paper on kinesthetic awareness and furthering our research in this subject. And we are so attached to the not only the acoustic sensations that we experience, but also the physical sensations. And we as human beings, we don't like pain. So anything we associate with pain, we are going to reject offhand. It's just going to be immediately, this is a no-go, it can only be bad. But yet that may not be the case for everyone.
Yes.
For another person, the sensation of distorted voice might be their wheelhouse.
Yes. Yes.
And if it's done well, if it's set up correctly and
here again, I mean, here's the thing that I try to drive home with my classically trained singers as well, who are teaching and who are taking voice ped courses, is, does that singer need to have a clear and resonant sound for the rest of their life? No, they don't need to. They're going to be amplified for the rest of their lives. Their entire career is built on being amplified.
Yeah.
They do not have to put any effort into making that sound, in fact.
No.
And they don't have to do it for a sustained period of time, and they don't have to do it loudly.
Yeah.
You're on a mic. You don't have to do it loudly.
No.
So what sounds to you like something that is a intensely over energized and intensely difficult sound to make may in fact be very, very easy to make, and it just sounds great because it's amplified. Like it sounds loud because it's amplified. It's not because it's a loud sound or because they're putting in so much effort to make it.
Yeah. Wow, we I've just looked over at the time and gone, oh, we've been, I know, right? I knew we'd have a bit of fun today. Is there anything, we do need to wrap up. Is there any...
Okay. Well, I think we covered it all, right? We hit all the big points, I think.
All the
voice
big...
classification, effort perception.
Belt.
Yes.
We solved the world's issues over belt. All we need to do is just direct people to this video now, and the world's problems around defining belt are done. Just draw a line under it.
Solved it.
Dr. Coates, Dr. Robinson, it's done.
We're over. We're done. I did have one little other thing, which comes up a lot, again, in my studio, because I teach, I have several classically trained voice teachers who come to me to work on belt for themselves.
Yeah.
Because they're teaching it in their studios, and they have always heard that belting is bad. And that it's going to ruin their voices. And they've got these wonderful singers in their studios who are singing naturally and healthily, and that they're going, I think that's actually good, and they can't demonstrate because it's scaring the crap out of them.
Yeah.
So as a classical singer then, as a classically trained singer then, that muscle memory is coming in. That's so interesting and something I'm going to start to use. But also because we perceive the belt sound as being high effort, we actually put more effort into creating it as a classically trained singer than we should. So we raise the larynx way too high, we constrict way too much, and we go into this terribly held and over-constricted phonation mode, which then of course only adds to that feeling of uncomfortableness. So I can't tell you the amount of times that I've actually talked to classically trained singers who are working on their belt sound or chest voice sound or mix or whatever you want to call it, who are working on that sound, how we actually go back to inhale like a classical singer, inhale for a low larynx, and then give me that sound, and then use your chest voice sound. And the difference is that then it starts to feel easy for them, and they go, wait, are you sure I'm actually belting? Yeah, you are belting, because it doesn't feel like they're belting anymore, because
Then
the perception is that it has to be full of effort. It has to be
they're
so
not getting the
hard.
kinesthetic feedback that they've originally associated. And I wonder too, is that I love that idea that you're talking about, to inhale on the basis of an appoggio inhalation that you know. I wonder whether that's actually helping them. It's giving them good retraction as well. So you're talking about a low larynx, so they're getting a really good retraction of the vocal folds, which means they're not starting with a slightly adducted process. So as a result, yeah, really interesting. I'm gonna explore that.
I mean, it just means that and this works very well, like I said, with the classical singers who are they're going way too far
Yeah.
with the, like, the constriction, larynx high, like they're just doing all the things that they think they're supposed to be doing to create this high energy, high intensity sound that,
Yeah.
it's just
Wow. Very cool. Very cool. I love having you on the show. It's been great to chat, and I hope we can do it again in the new year. Of course, we are literally weeks away from Christmas, for the festive season. So it's very much sneaking up on us, the end of the year. Where Linda, once again, just a shout out to Linda, who's been busily copying and pasting all of our Q&As from people. Linda, let's bump those over to next week, because I've got a student that arrives in 10 minutes, and I'm literally not going to get to them. So I will do my best to answer many of those questions where appropriate next week. Thanks everyone for hanging out. Thank you, Shannon, for your time and your efforts and all of the above. Let me just wrap the show up by saying goodbye to everyone. I hope you've enjoyed our live hangout today. I certainly did, and she's fantastic, and it's always good to talk voice with her, and I'd love to think we could have her back in the new year. We will do a Q&A, or we'll think of a subject to focus in on for next week, but I'll answer your questions next week. My apologies that I'm not going to get to them today, but we just run out of time when we got great guests on the show. And just to let you know, a heads up, in 2 weeks' time, I think we've got Wendy LeBourne on the show, who is one of the authors from Vocal Athlete. I'm super privileged to have her on the show. It's either her or Jessica Baldwin, who is fabulous, contemporary pedagogue. So I've got both of those ladies coming up before the end of Christmas. You've got to keep making sure that you tune into these live shows. Whether you watch them live or whether you watch them in replay, make sure you subscribe to the channel, ring the white bell icon. That's the terminology now, everyone. You ring the white bell icon. You don't hit the white bell icon, you ring it. And that way you'll get the notifications to know when we're going live, and also when the pre-record videos go live. Don't forget to check out this Wednesday. We've got a new one on pentatonic scales. As always, it's so good to hang out with you. I hope you have an awesome week. I'll catch you again soon. I'm Dr. Dan. Sing well.